1985 represented a landmark year for General Motors as it introduced the all-new 1985 Buick Electra, Olds 98, and Cadillac DeVille. These 1985 introductions of the so-called C-bodies represented GM's first foray into mass-produced, full-size, front-wheel drive vehicles with transversely mounted engines and transmissions. General Motors had dabbled in front-wheel drive vehicles before this, most particularly the Oldsmobile Tornado, which came out in 1966, and the Cadillac Eldorado, which came out in 1967. In 1979, the Buick Riviera would also go front-wheel drive and join the Tornado and Eldorado in that regard. But by 1985, again, this represented GM's first entry into the full-size front-wheel drive marketplace, and the C-bodies were hugely successful. Despite the fact that they were downsized significantly from their predecessors, with all riding atop 110.8-inch wheelbase, compared with an almost 119-inch wheelbase for the rear-wheel drive Electra and Olds 98. Despite the downsized wheelbase and overall length, as well as reduction in weight, which totaled about 700 pounds, these vehicles offered customers significant amounts of interior room, and in some cases, larger amounts of interior room than their predecessors. They consequently became well loved by the buying public, aside from some reliability issues that plagued the 1985 and 1986 model year cars. This particular car that I'm showing here is a 2,900-mile 1988 Buick Electra Park Avenue. Let's go around and talk a little bit more about some of the features of this vehicle. And the first unusual feature of this 1988 Electra Park Avenue is this clamshell hood, which was a Buick exclusive. The Olds and Cadillac C-bodies did not have this clamshell hood and eschewed this in favor of just a traditional opening hood. In order to open this clamshell hood on the Electra Park Avenue, one had to pull the inside hood release. Then you'd have to pull the hood about a foot or a foot and a half towards you. Then you could rotate it so that it opened. Notice also that the tops of the fenders are incorporated into the hood versus being, well, tops of the fenders, if you will. Interestingly, designers also envisioned a similar theme at the rear of the vehicle with the tops of the rear quarter panels integrated into the trunk, but this design was tossed out in favor of a more conventional design, both for cost and complexity reasons. Out back, however, there were some unique stylistic elements, the first being the Buick full-width tail lamps that would grace a number of Buicks, including the Riata, where it perhaps was taken to the largest extreme. There is one other element out back here that was unique to the Buick and I think was wonderfully designed as well as being functional, and that is that this vehicle has a drop-in slot for the license plate. You have to open the trunk in order to remove the plate from the vehicle, and then it simply slips out. It's not secured with any screws or fasteners, but it's a great anti-theft feature, and it makes it very, very simple to just swap out the plate. I think that was a brilliant idea that no vehicle that I know of has done before or since. You can also see that this vehicle on the rear quarter panel is badged Park Avenue, but this really was, as I've called it, an Electra Park Avenue. The Park Avenue name did not grace the full-size Buick until the 1991 model year when this car was redone. Instead, the Park Avenue was a trim line on the Electra, but it was a very, very popular one. In fact, in the 1988 model year, of all of the Electras sold, 84,853 were Park Avenue four-door sedans just like this. And 6,000 Electra limited sedans, non-Park Avenues, were sold, so very few. And there were about 2,000 T-type sedans sold, or the sporty version. So the one that you see here is really the version of this vehicle that was most often sold. Here's one close-up of that rear license plate area, and you can see that it's not secured with any fasteners, and that frame around it is just part of the overall body. Again, a super slick and unique detail for these Buicks. Now let's turn to the interior, and this is one of the areas where these C-bodies shine, is interior roominess. Note that there's no center console in this vehicle, so there's just a lot of open and airy spaciousness. At least that's the perception when you sit behind the wheel. And part of that is facilitated by the very low belt line and large glass area in these cars. They're vehicles that sit pretty low to the ground, at least by today's standards. But you do have great vision out the front. The A-pillars are relatively thin. The B-pillars, at least compared to today's vehicles, are relatively thin. And with the low belt line, there's a lot of glass area, so it feels like a nice, comfortable place to be. And comfortable is the word that I would use to describe that interior. It's something that is a carryover from the rear-wheel drive Electra Park Avenues in terms of the overall loose cushion look with the ribbed pattern. But these seats, having owned a 1987 Electra Park Avenue myself, I can tell you are very, very comfortable for long trips. By 1988, you also got, I believe, a cup holder in the center armrest there, a single cup holder. So you were allowed to start drinking in your vehicle. One element I don't really care for on these interiors is that faux wood grain. It just looks very unconvincing. The LeSabres had a nicer look in my mind with, as opposed to this faux wood grain, a fake brushed aluminum looking panel. And I think it was more tasteful and more suited to this vehicle. And here's a close-up of the instrument panel. A couple interesting things on the Buick, and one that's not shown in this picture is that at night, the speedometer just had this wonderful bluish-greenish glow to it that I thought was very classy, and you can't see it obviously here in this picture because it's taken during the daytime, but something that people will remember if you drove one of these. You can also see the fiber optic lamp monitors, that little bump, the raised bump in the middle of the IP that would allow you to see if your turn signals and headlights and bright lights were working. That was an optional feature on these Electra Park Avenues. And they have the standard Delco radio here with the equalizer. And then this car is equipped with automatic push-button climate control, which Buick had for a number of years and tended to work quite well overall. For whatever reason on these Buicks, the gear shift was different from the other vehicles. Well, I guess they all had different gear shifts. The Oldsmobile gear shift was different from the Buick, was different from the Cadillac. But the Buick always struck me as being odd. When you put it in drive, you can see the kink in the gear shift there. It kind of has it sitting low, and my guess is they did that so that your hand could reach the climate control panel without it being interfered by the gear shift. But if you ever have to put it in the number 1 speed for engine braking, it's basically hitting your knee. That's the downside to it, whereas the Olds gear shift is just fine. The climate control in the Olds was located in a different place on the instrument panel. Here's a shot of the rear passenger compartment area, and again, you can see why customers love these vehicles. Lots of rear seat legroom in these cars, in spite of them being much smaller overall than the previous generation rear-wheel drive vehicles. So the customers really never felt they were in the penalty box when they bought these cars. In fact, in some cases, the cabins felt more open and airy than the cars that they replaced. So this was, I think, one of the reasons why these vehicles sold so well as opposed to other General Motors downsize offerings like the 1986 EK cars, the Tornado, Riviera, and Eldorado, because these cars still had a good presence and they were very functional. So despite their downsizing, it seems like customers really enjoyed them. And here you're staring at one of the most notable reasons why customers like these vehicles, and that's because of what was under hood. The ultra-reliable Buick 3800 series engine. And 1988 was the first year for the 3800. Yes, there was a 3.8-liter V6 that was available in these vehicles in 1985, 1986, and there was a Buick 3.8-liter V6 even before that. But in 1988, it was a very special year because this engine got a balance shaft. Remember, this is a 90-degree V6, meaning it's not even firing. And the 3800 really had a number of differences versus the so-called even firing 3.8-liter V6 engine that was in the 1985, 6, and 7 model year cars. The engine block was even revised so that the banks are staggered on this engine. They were not staggered on the even firing V6 that preceded it. And this engine made 165 horsepower. In 1985, the 3.8, when it was released, had 125 horsepower, so quite a bit more by this point. This engine's velvety smooth, delivered excellent fuel economy on the freeway. It was not uncommon to get 30-plus miles per gallon with these full-size vehicles. These engines last forever, 200, 300,000 miles, even more sometimes. And the other important point was that the transmissions by the 1988 model year were also made much, much more reliable with the advent of electronic controls. The 1985, 1986 model years in particular, and their transmissions do tend to have some durability issues. But by 1988, that was all sorted out. Also, the power steering rack issues, where it would be hard to turn, particularly in the morning, that was generally sorted out. So if you're going to buy one of these and you're looking for a super reliable kind of classic car that requires minimal maintenance, really can't do much more than recommend one of these cars with a 3800 engine. Smooth, quiet, powerful, fuel efficient, durable. It's hard to really beat this. In fact, many General Motors fans were upset when GM replaced the 3800 and sunset it by the 3.6 double override cam engine, which did not prove to be nearly as reliable or cheap to operate as this 3800. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on this 1988 Buick Electra Park Avenue. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.